So it's clear across each of our three panelists' remarks that measurement is an essential ingredient of knowing if you're on the path to great education or not. And I think each have brought different perspectives on the measurement question. Paul speaking to the importance of measuring outcomes more broadly, not just educational outcomes, especially when you're looking at the early years. Heather speaking to the importance of funding education systems. Data doesn't produce itself. It's quite costly, and someone has to pay for that. And Bo speaking to some of the frontiers of education outcomes measurement, specifically amongst them the new efforts at the PISA level to push into the sphere of 21st century skills and understanding what measurement might look like on that next frontier. And Bo, I wonder if I could ask you to say a little bit more about that and invite the other panelists to join in as they desire.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. I think obviously assessments or measurements are critical to the accountability of education. I think one of the new things when we have benchmarks like Educating for the Future Index, I think that's really, really helpful, because that kind of puts a different orientation to what's most important, and also the developments of PISA. I think if I should wish for one thing, it would be also fantastic if we could put more attention to measurement of student engagement and how they enjoy learning new things, and think about how that correlates with learning outcomes. I think what seems to be working from the research we have been doing is also that assessments need to be integrated as part of the school day and the curriculum. It's not only the end outcome, which is important, but actually when you think about the unit where students share materials, comment on each other's work, different kinds of formative types of assessments, we need to integrate that. Multidimensional and integrated forms of assessment is actually beneficial for learning outcomes. And when we think about social emotional, I think we need to be much more specific, because they are critical, similar as creative, but we look at particular measures that have long-term benefits. So actually, do students have opportunities to support their peers, collaborate with others, resolve conflicts, work in groups, and do they have opportunities with emotions, to manage emotions, inhibit impulses, and keep attention and so forth? It's just difficult to measure it right now, because I don't think it's adequately supported in education. So how would one go around measuring it if students are not really allowed to collaborate in the school classroom, if they're not having choices to be able to regulate their emotions and put attention to what's most important? So, like, before we start, I think we can measure it, but do we have the environment that actually supports it and enable it before we start measuring it? I think it's an important question.
I think it's a great question, and I'm sure one that the rest of the audience can help us build on and build out from here. And so without further delay, I wanted to just pivot the conversation a bit and invite questions from the audience.
Thanks. It's Lucy from CamFed. Bo, I just wanted to pick up on your point there about measuring student engagement, because I think that is a critical aspect. Just to exemplify that, we have done major surveys across sub-Saharan Africa looking at the reasons why children are dropping out of school. The second reason behind poverty was low academic self-esteem, children not feeling that education was relevant to their lives. And in tackling that and looking at the issues to ensure young people felt engaged, felt enfranchised in relation to education, I mean, one of the dimensions was looking at the learning materials, that the learning materials that they were using were actually continuously reinforcing a sense of other and better for these young people, and redeveloping those materials and bringing in their own expertise, their own experience to inform them, had a transformative effect. I mean, young people weeping in the classroom and saying, how did you know my story? It wasn't their story, but it was the first time that they saw materials that actually represented them. Yeah. And we saw an incredible push-up in learning outcomes as part of that package of measures as a result. So it's coming back to the issue of values in education, that it's one thing for us to address the issue of exclusion, but it's another thing for us to address ensuring that young people feel enfranchised once they're in education.
I think it's a fantastic example, and it is low self-esteem, or whether it's confidence in learning new things or enjoying challenges. I think that's what some of the long-term studies indicate. Like, you have to enjoy learning, being curious, and then actually that's something that enables everyone to do that. But also the second point you mentioned, that there needs to be materials or environments around you which you can engage with and actually can support your engagement. If you don't have that stimulation, you're not able to be confident in what you can do. So, yeah.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here today and to hear these very important voices. Professor, you talked earlier about the importance of those first 3 months of education, which is ostensibly being in the home with parents. And too often when we think about education, we're really thinking about schools or university or colleges. Obviously, we know that Sure Start has recently been closed down. We won't talk about that. But do you think there is a way for policymakers to try to readdress the balance and try to make it more overt about how important those very early years are, and that the assumption that schools are the places where education really takes place, that we really need to say that it's more about those primary relationships?
Thank you. That's a big question. It's not either or. Obviously, it's about recognizing the importance of those different stages and what comes in those different stages of development. And I'm encouraged because I think there has been a huge shift in recent years to recognizing the importance of those first days of life. There's things like the Care for Development package, which looks globally not just at nutrition, but also stimulation. And I think the importance of parents' relationships in providing cognitive stimulation, which is what I guess called, but essentially it's through play and helping your child to learn from the very start of life, is an integral part of children's development. So studies have shown across the world that, yes, nutrition is important, but when you couple nutrition with cognitive stimulation, you get much better outcomes for the children across a range of outcomes. So I'm happy to highlight it. I think it feels a bit like we're pushing an open door. There's still a long way to go, but I'm very encouraged by the focus that's been on the first. People talk about the first 1,001 days in terms of a campaign, which is from the start of pregnancy, and I missed out pregnancy. Obviously, a lot happens during pregnancy that influences outcomes as well, but through to the age of 2. And it's not just that that's the only time that things can happen, because obviously things happen later as well that are very important, but it's a time when we can do enormous good. So I hope that partly answers your question.
Parents seem to be very conservative in their view about education, particularly when you look at what happens in schools. And I was struck by the picture of the dad playing with their 3-month-old. All of us look at that and we recognize that instinctively as being the right stuff to do. But what Bo talked about in terms of good education often looks messy. The typical parent is deeply conservative. Messy education is not what they regard as good education. Education is ordered, structured, like we had at school. How do we overcome that?
Well, obviously it's something we care a lot about, because our main ambition is to change attitudes and behaviors among adults, including parents. And I think it's partly being able to present what the future do look like. That the future for skills includes collaboration, navigating messy environments, being able to make decisions on information, what's valuable and what's not, and being able to come up with ideas in very complex situations. And if we as adults can convey that as parents, that that's the situation one needs to be in, you know, it feels sad that we should say education is scripted and instructed and not sensitive, because the reality children will grow up to is very massive and they need to make decisions. Of course, there are stages in terms of a child development where you need to find the right opportunities, but you know, I think we have to start with really illustrating what the change is for the future of skills. And also, again, that it's not against knowledge and so forth to do that. Yeah, but parents is a key challenge, including myself.
And if I can second that as your chair, I think if you think parents in the UK or the US are conservative in their expectations of education, you can't imagine what African or Indian parents are like. And one of the things we've certainly found in my own work is the importance of inviting parents into the classroom and making the classroom a safe space for parents who themselves are not literate is a challenge. It's a grand challenge. But as much as there's a dichotomy between the learning environment and real life, in the US or UK context, that dichotomy is even wider in the developing world. And so finding ways to very intentionally invite parents into the learning process, I've seen be essential.
Maybe adding one thing.
Yeah.
Actually, we did a cross-cultural study just a few months ago, so they can be fetched from our website, looking at parents' perceptions of play. What's interesting is more than 70% of parents actually say playful learning is the most effective ways, even in schools. But when coming to promoting it and actually doing it, they don't really choose the schools that are doing that. So I think it's also a matter of confidence that actually it is difficult, and they're having confidence that it's okay that things are a little difficult and challenging and so forth. But parents do want to do that, but it's difficult to overcome. Yeah.
Thank you. It's sort of following on from that, I suppose, really, but I'm interested at when play turns from being a good thing, which I think we've been very successful in the early years in starting to persuade people how valuable it is. And then there's some magical point, or not magical, some dire point, where people suddenly decide play is a bad thing. And I'm interested to know whether you think this is sort of a right conclusion or not. But I think part of it is the environment that the schools are. And certainly I've been in schools where there've been fantastic reception years, and then the teachers higher up the school are greatly concerned that children aren't being taught properly about how to sit at their desks because they're going to move around too much. And there was a project that I was involved with, which was a STEM learning project, not sold as a play concept, but it was play. Fantastic project, all the things that you've talked about in terms of student engagement, cooperation, problem solving, all those things at a higher level. It took a day to do. It didn't fit the school day. It didn't fit the curriculum. And very sadly, the only schools who were able to take it on were independent schools who'd got some flexibility. And I think, is it the environment that's partly the problem, or is it the will of the people? I'm curious to see what your thinking is on that.
It's a systemic problem, isn't it? I mean, that's in some ways a trite answer, but I think you can't just tackle this on one level, because we've talked a little bit about some of the beliefs that parents have and how we challenge that. I think that question goes right to the heart of it in a way, but also the way the school day is set up, the way the schools are structured, the things that get measured, the things that are thought about as important, all influence the flexibility that teachers, educators have to do anything. And I guess I bring a slightly different perspective to this in my work in clinic. As a child psychiatrist, I would have days sometimes where I see a succession of usually young boys, but not always young boys, with what would be labelled more or less ADHD, attentional difficulties, not able to sit still, not able to attend in the way that their teachers expected when they got to the ages of 6 or 7. And the catastrophic effect that has on their education and their ability to access education, the crushing of their self-confidence as learners, right from that very young age. So I'm not saying we've got everything wrong with our education system, but I think we have some, if I'm thinking about the UK, because that's what I know best, we have some fundamental things wrong with our education system if we're trying to offer an education to all children. Now, play and self-directed learning and collaboration are a part of that, but there's a much bigger picture. And I don't have all the answers. I think it's a huge problem to take on, but I think it's a really important challenge to take on. You might have the answers.
Well, I think one of the answers for me is that, we're not radical in terms of how play should look like in education. So when we look at play in schools, it actually just takes other forms and shapes. So in some of the research we are sharing right now is that, when we think about project-based learning, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning, and all kind of active forms of engagement, they actually do exist, and they are to some degree play-based. They enable choice, active engagement, interest and passion and so forth. So there are already good examples of how to make that work. But it's not, we don't have a language for it, and we have difficulty observing these practices right now. But we have identified 10 enabling factors, which includes like having the buy-in among the parents, being able to have the school leadership and support materials, and changing the approach to assessments also. So there are factors I think we can begin to work with, but we have to overcome the barrier that plays to kind of, is about only being able freely to do whatever you want. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nunzio Corelli from QS, and a great panel. I love the concept of messy collaborative education. I've got young kids, and I can really see how that works. My question is possibly for a slightly K-12, but slightly older group. So the innovations I see happening in the US a lot in the K-12 is personalized learning, where they're using smartphones and big data to be able to adapt the delivery of education to the pace and ability of a child. And in Africa, that seems to be quite relevant, where actually cheap phones are quite readily available. Is that something that you think plays a part in great education, or is it going the wrong direction? And is there any data on it?
Not a lot data, I would say, on it, but what we have been doing now is to look at the exact same principles of science, of how children learn, what are effective pedagogies, and saying what do the overlay of technologies mean for how you would teach and which kind of stimulation you would provide. So technologies is a forms of stimulation where you also need to be creatively engaged and have opportunities to make choices. So we use the same kind of parameters to measure that. So does it have engagement? Does it find connection to interest? Does it have opportunities to collaborate on these platforms? And then I think the really interesting question was raised just in the session just before around how is the science behind the teacher pedagogy? Like, in which way can teachers really use these technologies effectively for either instruction purposes, where you deliver content to get things started, or to guided forms of questioning where you start projects and conversations and have other peers to respond, or even allow students to freely engage in open-ended projects. So we've experimented with that in different forms and shapes, actually mostly in China. There's a lot of good examples of that in higher education. But it's not a new radical thing for the science. It's more a kind of a tool as a way of technology which we can support in that way. Yeah.
I guess to add on that, from the kind of Africa perspective, I think some of the challenges around technology in classrooms rely on the lack of power or the lack of ability to charge devices at home or at school. So there's definitely barriers in some of the most marginalised communities around accessing that technology. But I think the opportunities with it, if they can be overcome, and that kind of learning can be used in classrooms, then alongside kind of teacher support, I think that's a huge opportunity, yes.
Yeah, and I guess just one last thought to add in on that. I think that one of the interesting places we sit in the evolution of education globally is that we can all know with confidence that 20 years from now, children everywhere will learn in a completely different way than they do today. The challenge is today, right here, right now, which apps work for which kids and which deployment is reasonable to undertake in a context like Africa or South Asia. And there's as much as there's an interesting opportunity for further collaboration between the public and private on that. Inevitably, a lot of the ed tech innovation will come out of the private sector. The challenge with that is that the availability of publicly available evidence of what works and doesn't work is somewhat hampered by that. And so therein lies the powerful role for the public sector to advance that understanding. I think we had some hands over here.
Sorry, I've got...
up top. Sorry, I didn't see you.
I'd add from up top here. We are still here. I'm Dan from an education company called Sparks. I think the title of this session was What Makes Great Education? And I suppose my point is great education is made by sort of great research and scientific rigor to make sure education is delivered in the right way. And directly connected to the last session about, and what you just mentioned about education and education technology and private providers. In the world of medicine, and I know we've got some healthcare professionals here, you would never test out new drugs or medicines without thorough research and years of evidence. Yet we seem to be okay doing that with education, with new providers, with new fancy tools which have no rigor at all. How do we get the government and policymakers to really think hard about how to undertake years of research? Thankfully for all of us, there are very few small pharma companies. We're quite relieved about that. How do we have the same discipline and rigor within education? Obviously, I say that from a principle that at Sparks, we did 7 years of research before we ever went live and took our offering to the market. So keen to see what the policymakers and government would be thinking in that respect.
In response to that question, I'd love to invite the panel as well as if Professor Hedges wanted to contribute on that as well, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
The parallels are tricky, I think, because healthcare research incorporates a whole lot of different types of research, and I mean the easiest one to pick up is pharmaceuticals, but you could think about psychological interventions and so on. And some of those evolve through practice, adaptions of practice. I guess the answer, in some ways the answer that I come to is about the ethical framework, which might be different for different kinds of educational interventions as it is different for different kinds of medical interventions as well. So if you have an approach that is a subtle change, you might not need such a long period of adaptation and testing as you might if you've got something that's proposing a very fundamental change. But for me, it's about the systems you have in place and the ethical framework that you have for any of those kinds of things. I share your concern about interventions being introduced without being properly thought through. And I think that's sometimes because people assume and this happens in psychological treatments as well, sometimes people assume, well, it can't really be any harm, can it? It certainly happens in play research. If you put the word play in, people instantly assume, well, there can't be any harm in play. But that could encompass a whole lot of different things, most of which hopefully will be helpful, some of which might be neutral, which in itself is a problem because we don't want to be wasting children's time on interventions that have no benefit. So I share your concern. I think having the right framework in place, and that might be different for different kinds of interventions, is probably a substantial part of the answer.
Yeah, just to add on that, I think we have tried all kinds of evidence. We've done RCTs in South Africa, we've done observational studies, we've done cross-cultural studies and so forth, and there's not really one way to do that, but I think 3 things come to mind. The first thing is it's very difficult in our area to find research evidence because academic disciplines are not organized in a helpful way for us. So I've been walking around academic institutions for years looking for the door for play and children, and it does not exist. So we have created that kind of own environment. So we have to insist that we need to work across disciplines, as was noted in education as well as in play. The second thing is an organizational challenge. In the foundation, we have deliberately choose to say evidence, program activities, and buy-in is integrated. So we don't really make decisions on launching new things unless there is a government or policy or teaching institutions who wants to be able to apply these principles. There needs to be on-ground support to roll it out, and there needs to be evidence in place to say how do we actually follow up and evaluate how it's done. So whenever we make decisions, it's embedded in our framework to say evidence and program and buy-in needs to be integrated. In terms of funding, I think we've got a lot of way to help governments and policymakers to undertake some form of research, and I think impact bonds is one way to begin to do that. But I think the reality is corporates and NGOs need to be much more available to fund things like this. I'm not sure governments are actually equipped to have that long-term perspective. It needs to be other institutions that step in to support research.
Thank you very much. My name is Madeleine Arnott. I'm a sociologist, and sociologists are always naughty, so I'm going to be a bit naughty. I'm totally in support of what you're saying about early years education and play and the messiness, etc. But can we just talk a little bit about the older phase, the young adult, and what a great education actually means for them? And that's where, when does play stop and when does actually the hard stage of empowerment really get going? To me, the most fundamental question for education is why? And maybe it does start with the play at early years, but in fact, when you get to the young adult stage, and I'm calling teenagers young adults, because I think we actually assume they're still children, and in fact, they are young adults, and they have, in the global north, they have huge amount of information and already practicing adult behavior, and in the global south, they're already earning their livelihoods in many cases and working. and already young adults. So the age categories are already out of date. The education system is certainly in both contexts. There's a lack of time to actually teach young people about the more political issues, the controversies of the age. To me, that's about the why. There's the youth movement we've just been hearing about, the climate change movement of youth. They're telling us what a great education should be. Why are we in a situation of climate change in this context? Who caused it? Why is it not being addressed? And what sort of action should be taken? They are arguing for what sort of education they want, which is to address controversial issues. One could say the same thing for knife crime in this country. Why is it happening? So I remember writing about this and saying, I think my model would be that that young people, particularly in secondary education, should have something called controversial education, and they should have the space and the time to actually discuss the controversies of the age as a part of their education. And I just wonder, do you think we are achieving that level of critical analysis in our systems that you're talking about, and what contribution would you make to that agenda? Thank you. I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so it's a big question. It'll be over coffee, I'm sure.
I particularly liked your point on what causes climate change. I'm not sure we have the time on that one, but I think from my perspective, the questions you were raising should fit within when we're talking about global citizenship education. This concept of being able to address what's relevant to children and what are the issues, and giving them the critical tools to look at and analyse news and fake news, for example, especially at the moment, and to be able to make their own decisions about those processes. I'm not sure all the education, for sure, I don't think many of the education systems we're working with are currently giving young people the tools they need to do that, but they should be, and that's what we're aiming to do, and that's where this kind of systematic reforms and support to teachers to give them that space to hold those conversations needs to come in. And I think that's a big part of that is around teacher training, and teachers having the confidence to address those issues with children and give them the space to talk about what's relevant to their lives.
I'll do a very short note. I think because definitely the message from our side is that you shouldn't stop playing when you get into school, and in fact you should never stop playing, not as an adult, because it's critical for lifelong learning. But if one thing needs to be done to address what you're saying is, we're doing a lot to think about workforce skills and how that's changing. It would be fantastic if higher education also appreciated that what we need to get into higher education are students who are experimental, collaborative, creative, and not only A-grade students. Because if A-grade students are the only measure of success, that's what causes also some kind of distress and less critical thinking, experimentation among adolescents and so forth. So I think there's some kind of system factors we can begin to work with.
And I think, do we have time for one last question, or must we leave it there? Okay, we can do, one lucky and succinct soul can ask our last question.
Hi, hello. I have a quick question about the local foundation collaboration. Do you have just quite curious about, do you have collaboration with those education institutions specifically focusing on creative industry? Because I think this kind of play in learning is quite practical in cultivating the creativity education, especially in Far East Asia markets like China.
I'm very proud to say that we do have that many places. Creative for us is all kind of opportunities to combine, make, create things. And some of the greatest places are at Tsinghua University in China, which we support a lifelong learning lab. A fantastic institutions rolling that out as an ambition to have creativity higher on the end than China. But also MIT in Boston. So rolling out Scratch technologies, online platforms for allowing children to explore and create and make things. So most of our partnerships are about creative forms of education. We also set out a 2-year master degree on supporting play and learning in Denmark. So actually design education degree on creativity and play and learning. So it's all on our website. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. And on that happy note, I think we have a lot of great food for thought now to carry through to our next agenda item.
Thank you very much, Caitlin, Paul, Bo, and Heather.